The man known to history as Ulysses S. Grant was born as Hiram Ulysses Grant on the 27th of April, 1822, in Point Pleasant, a small rural community in the southwest of the relatively young state of Ohio. His father was Jesse Root Grant, a farmer, tanner, and leather merchant who hailed originally from Pennsylvania and who could trace his ancestry in America back to the first establishment of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Jesse had moved westwards along with so many Americans in the early 19th century in search of new opportunities as the United States expanded from the east coast of North America. Ulysses' mother was Hannah Grant, originally Hannah Simpson. Her ancestry lay amongst the Presbyterian Scots who had moved from Scotland to Ulster in the north of Ireland during the 17th century and then emigrated again in great numbers from Ireland to North America in the course of the 18th century. She had married Jesse Grant in 1821, and Ulysses was their first child. She was a deeply religious woman, and Ulysses is believed to have taken after his mother more than his father, although he might well have acquired his anti-slavery stance from Jesse, who was a proclaimed abolitionist, meaning that he wished for slavery to be brought to an end throughout the United States. Ulysses would grow up in a large household, as he had 5 siblings: Simpson, Clara, Orville, Jenny, and Mary. The family was well enough off that Ulysses was provided with a substantial education at numerous private schools. This included a stint at the Rankin Academy in 1838. This was run by John Rankin, a noted abolitionist and educator who was prominent in running the Underground Railroad at the time. This was a system of safe houses and transport networks which abolitionists in America used to help escaped slaves in the southern states flee from slavery. Grant was growing up at a time when the United States was expanding swiftly, having largely been confined to a series of states along the eastern seaboard of North America in the 18th century. American eyes were turning west from 1800 onwards, with expansion towards the Great Lakes in the north and westwards towards the Mississippi River and the border with Spain's colonial possessions in Texas, New Mexico, and California. Beyond this territorial expansion, the social fabric of the country was shifting dramatically. Under British rule, slavery had been practiced throughout the colonies, though it was engaged in to a much greater extent in the southern colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, with their sprawling cotton and tobacco plantations. Change was on the way, though, as by 1800, a number of northern states, including New York, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts, inspired by the abolitionist movement, had banned slavery by the time of Grant's birth. Others, such as New Jersey, had become free states, while the period of his youth and adolescence saw the states directly to the west, such as Illinois and Michigan, follow their more liberal neighbors to the east. The southern states, however, remained unswerving in their defense of the institution of slavery. And so the stage was already being set during Grant's youth for a titanic struggle between the northern and southern states. Ultimately, Ulysses would find himself foisted into the conflicts of American society in the mid-19th century, owing to a decision made by his father in 1839. At this time, when Ulysses was still just 17, his father requested an acquaintance to nominate his son to the United States Military Academy at West Point in the state of New York, then, as now, the leading military academy in the United States. The application was successful, though, owing to an error in his registration, Hiram Ulysses Grant was recorded as Cadet Ulysses S. Grant on entry. This new name stuck. Grant was initially skeptical about life at West Point, but he eventually grew into it, acquiring a reputation while there for his equestrian skills, though more broadly, he was only an average pupil. When he graduated in June 1843, he did so ranked 21st of 39 cadets in his class. Having finished at West Point, he was quickly appointed to the 4th Infantry Division and sent to St. Louis in the state of Missouri as a brevet second lieutenant. Grant seems to have been relatively uncommitted to a military career at this point, and considered this a temporary posting from which he might retire in a year or two. Yet, it was a highly significant period in other ways. While at West Point, Grant had befriended Frederick Dent, a fellow cadet who was slightly older than Ulysses. Dent originally hailed from Whitehaven near St. Louis, and Grant became a regular visitor at the Dent household following his arrival in Missouri. He soon struck up a relationship with Dent's sister Julia, and in 1844 they were engaged. The union, though, would not be formalized into a marriage for another 4 years, as war on the southern border interrupted their plans. The war, which erupted in 1846, was the direct result of the contentious position of Texas between the United States and Mexico. Texas had become part of Mexico when the country acquired independence from Spain in the early 1820s. However, Texas's position within the broader Mexican state was always contentious, and in 1836, it broke away into the new Republic of Texas. Thereafter, it gravitated towards the U.S., and when James Polk was elected president late in 1844, a major plank of his policy platform was expansion of the United States into Texas. This was duly accomplished in 1845 with the formal annexation of the Republic of Texas. Mexico was unwilling to accept this new dispensation. In particular, a boundary dispute arose over where the new border between the U.S. and Mexico should lie, with Polk's administration favoring the Rio Grande and the Mexican government arguing for the more northerly Nueces River. These issues spilled over into war in 1846. Grant's role in the war was limited as a junior officer, but formative nonetheless. He fought at the Battle of Palo Alto, the first major clash of the war near Brownsville, Texas, on the 8th of May, 1846. It was also the first time Grant had seen active combat. He subsequently served as a regimental quartermaster further west towards California and then in Mexico itself. In 1847, he earned a commendation for his role in the Battle of Molino del Rey near Mexico City. While he did not hold any major command during the U.S.-Mexican War, it is increasingly viewed as an important period in his development as a military commander. It was between 1846 and 1848 that Grant gained his first experience of warfare, and it was to be the only war he fought in prior to the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861. Ultimately, the U.S.-Mexican War ended in a total U.S. victory. General Winfield Scott advanced into Mexico itself and occupied Mexico City. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in February 1848 saw Mexico acknowledge U.S. control over Texas, with the Rio Grande established as the border between the two nations. In the aftermath of the war, Grant returned to St. Louis and married Julia Dent. Their relationship was close, though initially it caused tension between Grant and his parents, who disapproved of the Dent family's slave ownership. There was little doubting Ulysses and Julia's affection for one another. Julia had a cast in her left eye and squinted as a result. Years later, eventually they would have 4 children, 3 boys, Frederick, Ulysses Jr., and Jesse, and a girl named Ellen. However, their early family life was repeatedly interrupted by Grant's military postings. Following the war, Grant was moved between commands in Detroit and New York before being sent to California in the early 1850s. Gold had been discovered on the West Coast, and an increased military presence was required. Julia was heavily pregnant at the time, and Grant was forced to leave her behind. The next few years were bleak. Grant was moved repeatedly across California and the Oregon Territory, entered several failed business ventures, and began drinking more heavily. Eventually, repeated incidents of drunkenness and conflict with his superiors led him to resign from the military in 1854. At the age of 32, uncertain of his future, Grant returned east to St. Louis to rejoin his wife and family. Did not bring any relief from his hardships, as back in St. Louis, things went from bad to worse. Having accepted a farm allotment from Julia's father, he nevertheless continued to struggle financially, in part owing to an economic recession in the U.S. in 1857. A venture into real estate proved abortive, and in the late 1850s, Grant was reduced to selling firewood on a St. Louis street corner to make some extra cash, and even pawned a gold watch, a prized possession at one point. Years later, F. Scott Fitzgerald would state that there are no second acts in American life. He should perhaps have considered the highly successful second act of Ulysses S. Grant before making this assertion. In the early 1860s, Grant's life was to take a striking turn, brought about almost entirely by the crisis which enveloped America in the aftermath of the election of Abraham Lincoln as the 16th President of the United States in November 1860. Tensions had been brewing for decades between the free states in the north of the United States and the slave-owning states of the South. Now, in 1860, Lincoln, though willing to compromise with the slave-owning states, was built into a boogeyman by the southern states, one who would seek to end slavery altogether in America. As a result, upon his election, the state of South Carolina seceded from the Union in December 1860. It was soon joined by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. These 7 breakaway southern states formed themselves into a confederacy. Outright armed hostilities between the Northern Union and the Southern Confederacy commenced in April 1861 when Confederate forces attacked a Union-held garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Following this, several more southern states seceded and joined the Confederacy, the capital of which was eventually established at Richmond in Virginia. The American Civil War had begun. Grant rejoined the Army after a near 7-year absence. In the initial stages of the conflict, he was involved in efforts to recruit and train forces in Missouri and Illinois, but it was not long before he was given a command in southern Illinois. Based on his previous military experience, he spent the first year of the war operating in the border region between southern Illinois and Kentucky and further south towards Tennessee, playing a delicate balancing act in areas where military heavy-handedness was frowned upon. At the beginning of 1862, frustrated by his lack of major commands, Grant sought and received permission from General Henry Halleck to undertake an offensive campaign, advancing south with 25,000 men. He won one of the first major victories of the war for the Union when he besieged and captured Fort Donelson on the River Cumberland in Tennessee. About 15,000 Confederate troops were captured in the engagement. Grant proved his daring approach when the commander of Fort Donelson inquired what terms of surrender might be offered. Grant replied that the only terms he was prepared to offer were unconditional surrender. As a result of his actions, Grant was promoted to the rank of Major General. 2 months later, he was the major Union commander at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee, where over 100,000 Union and Confederate troops fought. Grant was technically victorious and repelled the Confederate incursion, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, which resulted in over 10,000 Union troops being killed or wounded. Grant's reputation, which had soared following Fort Donelson, was now damaged, a situation worsened by reports of his drinking. While exaggerated stories of Grant keeping a barrel of whiskey by his tent can likely be dismissed, there is substantial evidence that he was prone to bouts of heavy drinking, though he often abstained for long periods, especially when major responsibilities lay ahead. Despite these setbacks, before the end of 1862, Grant convinced his superiors to allow him to proceed towards Mississippi, where he planned to seize Vicksburg, one of the Confederacy's major strongholds on the Mississippi River. He succeeded 6 months later when the city surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863. The Vicksburg Campaign ensured Union control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in two between the Western Territories and the core Southern states east of the river. While Grant was making a name for himself in Tennessee and Mississippi, the war continued with mixed results elsewhere. The conflict intensified in the eastern states around Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, where the Union and Confederate capitals lay less than 100 miles apart. In 1863, the war turned decisively. That year, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, making the abolition of slavery in the Confederate States an explicit war aim of the Union. Henceforth, Union victory would mean the end of slavery throughout the United States. After winning a significant victory at Chancellorsville, Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched a campaign northward into Pennsylvania. This culminated in the three-day Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest engagement of the entire Civil War, in which Lee's Army of Northern Virginia suffered devastating losses. Combined with Grant's capture of Vicksburg a day later, Gettysburg placed the Union firmly on the offensive. The battle is also remembered for Lincoln's Gettysburg Address later that year, affirming that the war was being fought to ensure that freedom would not perish from the earth. In recognition of his achievements, Grant was appointed Lieutenant General in March 1864 and placed in overall command of the Union Army. His strategy was simple: use the Union's numerical superiority to contain Lee's forces in Virginia while other Union armies advanced elsewhere. Although Grant failed to capture Richmond in 1864, even after the bloody stalemate at Cold Harbor, his forces settled into a prolonged siege of Petersburg. Over time, the Confederacy became increasingly isolated and exhausted. By late 1864, Atlanta had fallen, and Union forces had reached the Atlantic coast. Desertions increased among Lee's troops, and by spring 1865, the Confederate position was untenable. The Civil War ended on the 9th of April, 1865, when Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. Grant offered generous terms, allowing Confederate soldiers to return home without reprisals. The last Confederate forces surrendered weeks later. Just 5 days after the surrender, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Grant narrowly avoided being present and survived amid rumors that he too had been a target. Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln as president. The war's end ushered in the era of Reconstruction, a period aimed at ending slavery, restoring the Union, and transforming Southern society. Reconstruction would dominate American politics in the years that followed, particularly during Grant's presidency from 1869 to 1877. Even prior to his tenure in the White House, Grant was involved in Reconstruction politics. In the months after the conclusion of the Civil War, he was sent on a tour of the southern states at the behest of President Johnson. This was important for two reasons. Grant was received favorably during his travels throughout the former Confederate states. Somewhat surprisingly, given his position as the Union's foremost general, this suggested that he could be a unifying figure during the Reconstruction period. Secondly, Grant submitted a report to Johnson upon completion of his tour, in which he recommended a lenient approach towards the former Confederate states. He had visited them in order to help end the bitterness of the Civil War. His drift towards politics did not end there. In 1866, he was appointed a general of the Federal Army, now that the Union titles of recent years were dispensed with. Then, in 1867, when Johnson removed Edwin M. Stanton from his position as Secretary of War, Grant was offered the post. Grant accepted the office on an interim basis in August 1867. However, a constitutional problem arose surrounding the Tenure of Office Act. This dictated that a sitting cabinet secretary could only be removed by the executive with the consent of the Senate. As such, Johnson needed Stanton's removal to be sanctioned by the upper house of Congress. When the Senate refused to approve Stanton's dismissal in December 1867, Grant resigned in January, provoking a split with Johnson, who had believed that Grant would refuse to relinquish the position as Secretary of War. This resulted in the decision over Stanton being sent to the courts for adjudication. The major outcome of the split between Johnson and Grant's brief flirtation with the office of Secretary of War was that he was now viewed as a potential presidential candidate. Within the Republican Party, at the Republican National Convention in Chicago in mid-May 1868, Grant won the party's support. He would run against the Democrat Horatio Seymour, a former governor of New York. The Civil War hero ran his campaign on the slogan, "Let us have peace." Ultimately, the election race was much closer than many observers had expected. Grant won by just 300,000 votes in the popular vote, though the Electoral College result was far more decisive, with Grant securing 214 votes to Seymour's 80. On the 4th of March 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was sworn into office as the 18th President of the United States. He would serve for 8 years, winning a second term in 1872 with a far more comprehensive victory over a divided opposition. During the 8 years in which he served as president, Grant faced a large number of serious challenges. None was more pressing than Reconstruction and the task of reunifying the country after the trauma of a 4-year civil war. 2 weeks after entering office, he signed laws guaranteeing African Americans equal rights. In the months that followed, his administration pressured former Confederate states that had not ratified the 15th Amendment into doing so. This amendment guaranteed Black Americans the right to vote. The trade-off for the Southern states was readmission to the Union once ratification was complete. As a result of this carrot-and-stick approach, by 1871, recalcitrant states such as Georgia, Virginia, Mississippi, and Texas had complied and were readmitted. In other respects, Reconstruction proved far more difficult. Armed bands of traditional Southern conservatives emerged across the former Confederate states in the late 1860s and early 1870s. The Ku Klux Klan was the most prominent of these, along with groups such as the Red Shirts and the White League. Collectively known as Redeemers, these groups used violence and intimidation to restore democratic control in the South and impose a white supremacist agenda. In response, Grant's administration created the U.S. Justice Department and tasked it with suppressing these movements. Federal troops were dispatched to key areas to maintain law and order and defend Reconstruction. As a result, Grant's administration effectively crushed the Ku Klux Klan for a generation by arresting hundreds of senior members and prosecuting many of its financial backers. Nevertheless, by the mid-1870s, it was clear that Reconstruction was faltering. Redeemer Democrats sought to create a Southern society which, despite the abolition of slavery, would still disenfranchise and brutally oppress the African American population. Reconstruction was closely tied to the nation's finances. During the Civil War, the Union government had issued banknotes not backed by gold or silver. This departure from the traditional standard caused inflation. To address this, Grant passed the Public Credit Act within weeks of entering office. This promised holders of Civil War-era banknotes that they would be repaid in coin backed by gold and silver. The measure aimed to curb inflation and restore confidence in the financial system. This policy continued the economic recovery that had begun under Johnson's administration. However, economic troubles soon followed. In 1873, the collapse of the New York firm J. Cook & Company, heavily involved in railroad construction, triggered a major financial crisis. This was compounded by weaknesses in the global economy, particularly after Germany demonetized silver following its unification, causing financial instability in Europe. The resulting downturn led to a prolonged depression that lasted for the remainder of Grant's second term. At the time, this was known as the Great Depression, a term later reassigned to the much deeper crisis after the Wall Street crash of 1929. Today, the economic crisis of 1873 to 1877 is known as the Panic of 1873. In foreign policy, Grant was cautious and largely pacifist. Despite his military background, he sought to avoid war and delegated diplomacy to his Secretary of State, Hamilton Fish. One major issue was the demand for reparations from Britain for its support of the Confederacy during the Civil War. This was resolved by the Treaty of Washington in 1871, in which Britain agreed to pay over $15 million. Anglo-American relations improved steadily thereafter. In the Caribbean, Grant maintained neutrality during the 10 Years' War between Cuban rebels and Spain. However, his administration took a more interventionist approach toward Hispaniola, divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Grant believed that acquiring Santo Domingo would give the U.S. strategic influence in the Caribbean and access to the sugar trade. Negotiations began in 1869, but ultimately failed due to opposition in Congress. The episode tarnished Grant's reputation somewhat and foreshadowed the growing imperial ambitions of the United States later in the 19th century. Grant's approach towards the Native American people was enlightened by 19th century standards. He was a relatively benign assimilationist, believing that Native Americans should be treated fairly and encouraged to embrace the benefits of Western education, economy, culture, and government. By today's standards, this may seem like a heavy-handed form of cultural intolerance, but in a country that had seen several presidencies in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s whose policies toward Native Americans bordered on genocidal, Grant's approach was comparatively progressive. As a result, several peace treaties were negotiated with the Apache and Sioux nations of the Plains in Midwest during his first term, and conflict between Native Americans and the federal government reached a historic low. However, Grant's Native American policy could not ultimately escape the historical circumstances in which it was conceived. Decades of conflict, oppression, and broken promises had created deep animosity toward the U.S. government among the Plains Indians. This situation worsened in 1874, when gold was discovered in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory. As prospectors flooded into the region, the Sioux, led by Red Cloud, Crazy Horse, and Sitting Bull, prepared for war. The Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877 marked a bitter end to Grant's presidency. Although Sitting Bull's Lakota Sioux famously defeated General George A. Custer at the Battle of Little Bighorn in June 1876, the war ultimately ended in victory for the federal government. By the time the conflict concluded, Rutherford B. Hayes had succeeded Grant as president. Hayes's administration imposed a harsh peace settlement, annexing Sioux lands and forcing Plains Indians onto reservations, a grim conclusion to Grant's more enlightened Indian policy. In many other respects, Grant was ahead of his time. In 1875, he proposed a constitutional amendment to weaken the influence of religious institutions over public education, effectively advocating a stronger separation of church and state. He was also progressive in his support of Jewish Americans, appointing dozens to federal office. Perhaps most notably, he appointed Eli S. Parker, a Seneca Indian, as Commissioner for Indian Affairs. Grant's presidency, however, was not without scandal. During the 1872 election campaign, it emerged that prominent Republicans had siphoned profits from the Union Pacific Railroad through a corrupt entity known as Credit Mobilier. Grant himself was not implicated, but the scandal damaged his administration. Worse followed in 1875 with the whiskey ring scandal, involving federal officials and distillers defrauding the government of tax revenues through bribery. Grant was again personally innocent, but his private secretary and Secretary of War were implicated, further tarnishing his presidency. The final act of Grant's presidency became one of the most controversial episodes in U.S. electoral history. With Grant barred by tradition from seeking a third term, Republicans nominated Rutherford B. Hayes against Democrat Samuel Tilden in the 1876 election. The result was fiercely disputed. Tilden won 184 electoral votes, one short of victory, while Hayes had 165, with 20 votes contested in Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina, and Oregon. As sitting president, Grant played a crucial role in preventing a constitutional crisis. He insisted the dispute be resolved legally, refused to deploy the army, and established an electoral commission. The resulting Compromise of 1877 awarded the presidency to Hayes, who won by the narrowest margin in U.S. history. In return, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction and paving the way for Jim Crow laws and decades of African American disenfranchisement. Although Grant's legacy is sometimes linked to this outcome, he was widely praised at the time for averting renewed civil conflict and preserving constitutional order. Once Hayes assumed office in March 1877, Grant became a private citizen at just 54 years old. Far from retiring quietly, he embarked with Julia on a 2.5-year world tour beginning in 1877. They met Queen Victoria, Pope Leo XIII, Otto von Bismarck, Napoleon III, and composer Richard Wagner before traveling to the Holy Land, Egypt, and later Asia. In Japan, Grant even played a role in easing tensions between Japan and Qing China and survived an assassination plot. Returning to the United States in 1879, Grant was urged by Republicans to seek a third presidential term. At the time, no law barred this, though tradition discouraged it, following the precedent set by George Washington. Now, however, many believed that tradition should be ignored in order to bring Grant back for a third term. Grant was not opposed to the idea and encouraged his supporters to put forward his name at the Republican National Convention, which met in Chicago in early June 1880. What followed was a chaotic convention. 3 main candidates emerged: Grant, James G. Blaine, and John Sherman. Grant secured the most votes in the initial ballots, but not enough to reach the 370 votes required for official nomination. After dozens of inconclusive rounds of voting, the impasse was finally broken when Blaine's supporters devised a plan to nominate a compromise candidate in the form of James A. Garfield. Like Grant, Garfield was a former Union general who had fought in the Civil War. Realizing he had been defeated, Grant eventually threw his support behind Garfield. The Republicans finally had a candidate, one who went on to win the presidential election. However, Garfield's presidency was tragically short-lived. He was assassinated in September 1881, just months after his inauguration, becoming the second of 4 U.S. presidents to be killed in office. Garfield's vice president, Chester A. Arthur, succeeded him and served until 1885. In the aftermath of his world tour and failed presidential bid, Grant returned to the world of business. At the time, former presidents received no pension, and Grant had never been a wealthy man, nor an astute businessman. His post-presidential ventures proved no exception. Remarkably, the Grants actually lost money on their world tour, despite Grant's global fame. An investment in the railway sector in the early 1880s also failed. In 1883, Grant became involved in a Wall Street firm established by his son, Ulysses S. Grant, Jr., and Ferdinand Ward, a financier who was later revealed to be a con man. Ward engaged in extensive fraud, operating what was effectively a pyramid scheme involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. As a silent partner, Grant was almost certainly unaware of the wrongdoing. Grant later testified against Ward in court in 1885. When the full extent of the fraud emerged, it generated widespread sympathy for Grant, who had been heavily swindled. While living in New York, the former president was working on what became the only truly profitable venture of his life. A gifted storyteller, Grant decided to write his memoirs. His financial situation was greatly improved when Mark Twain offered to publish them and guaranteed Grant 70% of the royalties, an extraordinarily generous gesture. Completed in the early summer of 1885, the memoirs were widely praised for their honesty and clarity. They became a bestseller, allowing Julia Grant to live comfortably on royalties that ultimately approached $500,000, a vast sum in the late 19th century. Grant, however, did not live to see their success. In the summer of 1884, he developed a throat condition that was diagnosed as cancer later that year. The disease progressed rapidly, and Grant died on July 23, 1885, just days after finishing his memoirs, at the age of 63. Around 1.5 million people attended his funeral in New York City on August 8, 1885, forming an 11-kilometer procession. At the time, Grant was eulogized as a figure comparable to George Washington. He was first buried in Riverside Park and later reinterred in the General Grant National Memorial in Upper Manhattan, the largest mausoleum dedicated to an individual in North America. During much of the 20th century, Ulysses S. Grant developed a reputation as one of America's worst presidents, a view reinforced by opinion polls and surveys. Although assessments have improved somewhat in recent decades, he is still generally ranked around the middle of the presidential rankings. Yet this judgment is largely unfair. Grant certainly had flaws, but as both a military commander and president, he accomplished a great deal during one of the most turbulent periods in U.S. history. His military record speaks for itself. Though he gained early experience during the Mexican-American War, he drifted away from military life until the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 brought him back into service. He rose rapidly, becoming the Union's most important commander and playing a decisive role in the defeat of the Confederacy in 1864 and 1865. While some historians argue that Grant benefited from overwhelming resources against Robert E. Lee, other Union generals had enjoyed similar advantages and failed. Grant succeeded, and his importance to the Civil War is unquestionable. As president, his legacy is more contested. Grant guided the nation through Reconstruction and post-war economic stabilization and was easily re-elected in 1872. He significantly curtailed the power of the Ku Klux Klan, even if it re-emerged in later decades. His Native American policies, though ending in war, were relatively progressive for their time, and the Great Sioux War was as much the product of decades of Western expansion as of Grant's actions. Finally, his role in resolving the disputed election of 1876 deserves recognition. By preventing a constitutional crisis and renewed violence, Grant preserved national stability at a critical moment. Ultimately, Grant has been unfairly denigrated by history. Though flawed and often contrarian, he navigated extraordinary challenges with determination and integrity. Many presidents held in higher regard might not have governed as effectively during the difficult years following America's only Civil War. That is to his credit. What do you think of Ulysses S. Grant? Should he be remembered primarily as a Civil War general, or has his presidency been unfairly dismissed? Let us know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to support the channel,